For the first few months after our arrival in Erie in June 1947, we used Vernon's 41 Chevy to go back and forth to home in our periodic visits every month or so. But I knew that I needed a better car than my 31 Chrysler because I was lucky to be able to make it to Erie one time with that car, and depending on it for frequent travels back and forth was not in the cards. And of course I'd depend on him a lot too for if we had to go any distance at all, because that old Chrysler was a little shaky and neither one of us wanted to get caught with a broken down car away from where we were staying. So I decided to look for another car. I kept looking around and I did find an advertisement for a 37 Ford, and the guy wanted $400 for it. So Vernon and I went over there and looked at it. He had the engine rebuilt recently. He told me that anyway, and I had never had a reason to disbelieve him because the engine worked fine. The problem with that old car, though, was rust, and Fords were noted for rust. Doors and the floor pans and stuff just had holes in it, and this was no exception. I could look down between my legs there, or I was sitting in the car, and I could see the ground underneath me. And the door of the hinge area was rusted and left the door sag. I corrected that situation to a great deal by taking a 2x4 and running it diagonally inside the door behind the upholstery, and that supported that lower hinge area that was rusted out, and jacked the door up enough so it didn't scrape on the running board every time I tried to open it. This is a picture of an old 37 that recently sold on the internet for $6,800 the way it is. And obviously it's going to take many thousands more to put it on the road. Other 37 Fords that have been modified and fixed to the final T have been advertised for up to $75,000. So I guess I got rid of a gold mine at rock bottom price when I traded mine in. I guess gold mines were selling for a lot less in those days than they are now. And so it was pretty rusted, but it did run well, and it had a new clutch in it, which was a big feature because those old Fords had an extremely weak and terrible clutch. When the clutch was worn a little, it would chatter, especially if you tried to reverse. The whole car would just jump up and down. But as it wore, even just trying to start out would cause the car to jerk and vibrate something fierce. It was strong stuff. So the only cure was to replace it with one just like it. But in any case, the clutch was smooth and the engine started right up, and it didn't burn any oil either, I found. So I was really happy with that car. It would do 80 miles an hour in second gear. And, it wouldn't do a whole lot more than high, but boy, and with second gear, with the engine revved up, I liked it. Ford didn't have a heater in it. And I decided to solve that problem. And I went into Western Auto one day, and I saw this Southwind gasoline heater that could be installed on any car. So I bought it. It was $20-some. It wasn't very cheap. I mounted the thing underneath the dash, and I had to drill a hole in the carburetor base and put a little self-tapping fitting in there and run a tube over through the firewall into the heater. And this heater burned gasoline directly out of the engine. And boy, did it ever work. Turn it on, you pulled a knob on the front housing, and instantly red hot air came blowing out of that thing. And it wasn't long before the rubber floor started to curl up and smoke. So that was a signal to turn it off for a while and let the floor mat cool off. But it was a heater par excellence. But it really had a terrific effect on the gas mileage. At best, that Ford would only do about 18 miles a gallon. And with that heater, it dropped it down to about 12 or 13. But in the winter, and all the ill-fitting rusted doors and holes in the floorboards and so forth, it really did a fine job. Another novel feature of that car was the radio. Although it was an aftermarket, it was a rarity in cars of that vintage, and it was bolted to the underside of the dash. The dial could be read properly, but the works of the radio hung upside down. In other words, the tubes hung from their bases rather than sitting on top of the base. And so when you hit a bump or something, they come out of their sockets and fall into the radio case. And so there were 4 or 5 tubes in that radio, and periodically one or the other would fall out, and the 4 screws that held the cover on had to be removed, and the radios, the tubes put back in their sockets. But it was kind of a pain. It didn't have a lot of power either. You could only get local stations if you were reasonably close to them. But it was a big deal for me. I was less discriminating in those days, I guess. Until the advent of power steering, cars were a chore to drive. You had to stay alert every minute because the car would wander over the highway, especially if there was a little crown on the road, which most of them are crowned for water drainage. If you didn't keep your eye on the road and keep adjusting the steering wheel, you'd soon be off the road or across it. Especially if you had some linkage that wasn't really snugged up. And most of the cars in those days had slop, as they called it, in the steering wheel. In other words, you had to turn the steering wheel a certain amount to get some input into the mechanism below because of the clearances and all the joints and the gear in the steering box. Driving was an effort that kept you on the edge of your seat all the time, and it was very tiring. In 1926, Chrysler came out with a car that had hydraulic brakes, and they really worked well. My old 31 Chrysler had hydraulic brakes, but this old Ford in 1937 still had mechanical brakes, and old Henry Ford was so adamant about not trusting hydraulic or liquid stuff to brake the car that he refused to change to hydraulic brakes, as everybody else had long before him. And he produced Fords with mechanical brakes until 1938. The early models of 38 had them. The brakes on this car were terrible. You never knew whether you were going to stop or not, or how you were going to stop, or what position you were going to stop in, especially if the roads were slippery or wet. I remember coming down a steep hill between Peach and State Street in Erie, and I hit the brakes, and I don't know which wheel grabbed first, but one of them did, and spun me around twice there in the middle of that street. Fortunately, there wasn't other cars nearby, and that was a busy street that I was on, 26th Street. Forget that. It was pretty scary, but the stopping distance on that thing was, well, of course, depended on the speed, but at higher speeds it would have taken half a mile, maybe more. I don't know if you'd even get stopped. Oh, Henry might have been slow with his brake modernization program, but he was far advanced in the engineering of his engines. Well, Henry not unique in making a V8 engine. They had already been used in Lincolns and Cadillacs several years prior to that. However, those engines were extremely expensive because of the way that they had to cast the blocks in those days. And so the engines that those cars had were far too expensive for the average run-of-the-mill car. So Henry developed new casting methods so that the block could be cast in one piece, and he began production of the V8s. I think the first V8 cars that he produced was 1932, but they were an instant hit. They were so superior to the straight sixes that everyone else used that he had the domination of the market. And Chevy and Plymouth didn't go to V8s until after the war, in the early 50s. So he had dominance in the V8 engine power. Not only did he make V8s, but he made V12s and V16s for the Lincoln Zephyrs and the Lincolns that he produced. I always lusted for one of those Lincoln Zephyr V12s or V16s. They were just like a little, they were like a sewing machine. They were so silent and quick. I don't think they developed a great deal of horsepower, probably 125 or something like that in those days. But they were They were fast revving and, well, they were just a sweet engine, that's all I can say. But I never had one. And anyway, he was a really a true engineer, no doubt about that. Well, Henry Ford was the Elon Musk of his day, and he also believed in making all the components possible that he could for his company, rather than buying it from outside vendors and not being able to control the quality and knowing for sure what went into the products. And he figured that he could make money making those components himself. So he did a lot of things. When you sold a part to Ford, the specifications included the type of container that they were supposed to be shipped in, and he required his vendors to ship in pine boards of a certain length. He reused those boards in the floorboards of his cars. So he had a crew that dismantled the shipping containers and transformed them into a free product for his vehicles. Then, of course, tires were also a big issue. He and Henry Firestone were big buddies, and Firestone made the tires for Ford. But Henry, he wanted to go further than that, so he went down to South America and bought, I don't remember how many thousands of acres, a large number, in Brazil, and hired people to go down there and set up buildings and a factory to process rubber. He decided he would grow his own rubber, and so he planted thousands of acres of rubber trees. Of course, he had to wait about 5 or 6 years for them to mature, but started out well. But as the years progressed, the climate was not exactly favorable for growing rubber trees, and eventually that failed. He couldn't produce enough to make it viable. Some of the buildings and the old rubber processing plant are still extant down there, but they've been abandoned or taken over by the natives. He also made his own steel, and he started a major steel plant along the Detroit River, and it's called River Rouge. It's still in operation. It was one of the largest steel plants in the world, and he had his own lake carriers that brought iron ore from the Mesabi Range in Minnesota down there. I was never on a boat that hauled ore to the River Rouge plant, but there were lots of them, and I saw them many times during the 2 summers that I was on the Great Lakes. Steel directly from the iron ore into the finished goods, right on site of the assembly plants. That was a good investment for him. He made a lot of money there. One time when I was on the Great Lakes, we landed at Detroit, and I took a tour through the River Rouge plant. Inside these huge buildings, they had walkways mounted high on the inside walls of the factories, and you could join a tour. They had regular tours that used these walkways to pass through the factory without interfering. I went through the steel plant and watched them make cold rolled steel. Ford also made glass for his cars. He had a factory there in Detroit that made laminated glass. But his process was not perfected, and after a year or 2 or 3 possibly exposure to the sun, the thin layer of isinglass that he used between the 2 layers of glass to act as a shatter-resistant material would separate, and you couldn't see through the glass. And this always began around the edges of the pane and progressed inward. And Pennsylvania had a state law that separation and distortion could not exceed a certain amount, otherwise you had to replace the glass. My old Ford barely was less, so I never had to replace the glass. But every window had this. Of course, he made his own springs, and the old Fords only had 2 springs. They were crossways from the center of the car out to the wheels, and they were leaf springs with about 9 or 10 leaves in them, but there was only one on each end. Fords were known for rusting, as I mentioned earlier, and one of the things that created that situation was that the cars were painted on the exterior only. The interior surfaces of the sheet metal doors and bodies and floors were not painted at all. And of course, in those days, the use of salt, pure rock salt, was common, and it didn't take long for that salt to start rusting and eating away the steel from the inside. So it when you bought a Ford, you bought a layer of paint and then whatever steel hadn't rusted away beyond beyond that. But they were tough cars, and they had a good reputation for being tough and always starting instantly. Other cars, especially Chrysler products, were very, very lucky to start at all in the cold or damp, especially climate or weather. Their ignition systems were just not up to what was required to do the job properly, whereas Fords really were top notch. And you started the car with a push button too. On other cars, you had to lift up your foot high off the floor and press a long rod through the firewall that actuated the starter. It was a nuisance, and it wasn't very, very user friendly. Everybody else eventually adopted that push button system, but he was the first one with that. The key performed two functions. When you inserted the key into the lock and turned it, it also permitted the unlocking of the steering column, and there was a little lever there that you had to move forward to unlock the steering column. So if you didn't have the key, you might be able to get it started by hot wiring it, but you couldn't unlock the steering column. So it prevented the car from being stolen. In fact, the man I bought that car from told me that someone had tried to steal it, and they got it as far as the end of the street, but they couldn't turn, so they had to leave it parked right in the middle of the street. And of course that V8, while it was still only 85 horsepower, the same as the Chevy and the Plymouths, it was much quicker in acceleration because of its design, and so it was a hot rod of that era. Henry Ford, a genius in his own right, but as he got older, he got more eccentric, and that's why the Fords didn't get hydraulic brakes until 1938, whereas the Chryslers had it in 1926, I think they first came out with them, more than 10 years earlier. When World War II broke out, airplanes were vitally needed. Near Ypsilanti, Michigan, about 30 miles north of Detroit, the plant was titled Willow Run. He committed to build a B-24 Liberator, a four-engine bomber, every hour, and which meant that he had to provide 1,200,000 parts for every airplane every hour. But how they kept track of all those parts, which they didn't make all the parts themselves, obviously, and those parts had to come from various suppliers surrounding the area and in the country, and to keep track of that, the logistics must have been a nightmare. Those are the people who were the heroes, too, in making sure that those parts never were short, because even just a few parts, one or two parts, could shut the whole thing down. So it's like Elon said, making the car is easy, it's getting the factory to run and produce is the hell. Working in those plants was a living hell. The rate of speed was really high, and it kept increasing over the years, and the relationships of the supervisors to the hourly workers was hostile. The foreman and the supervisor level treated the hourly worker as dispensable, and if they weren't allowed to talk or during their working hours, as they stood side by side frantically running all these products through their workstation, they weren't permitted to leave to go to the bathroom. They had very brief time for lunch, and if they were late, they were fired, because there was always a sea of people out in the parking lot waiting to be hired, and they were replaceable in a moment's notice. And Henry Ford wasn't the only one who treated their employees in that manner. It's pretty common for employers to treat their hourly workers as dispensable, disposable. But the turnover really was costing Henry a lot of money, because they had to do so much training and slow the assembly lines down. And the going daily rate was $2. And my uncle Hector worked for Ford at $2, and he was there when Henry Ford decided to solve his problem by raising the rates to $5. That was so much more than anybody else was making that the turnover immediately dried up. But the crowds out in the parking lot increased, so he solved his problem, and he took an enormous amount of criticism from the other manufacturers around there who lost their key employees who flocked to Ford when that news came out. My uncle worked for Ford, but he didn't work in the factory, he worked on a farm. Ford owned many farms and raised crops to feed the increase in population around there. And my uncle was a farmer by birth and upbringing. In those days, windshield wipers were operated by vacuum from the engine. And that worked fine as long as you weren't accelerating and dropping the vacuum pressure in the engine, which then, if it was raining, immediately affected the motion of the wipers. And as you're going up a hill and you needed a lot of extra acceleration to get the old engine to make it up the hill, the wipers would stop altogether. It was a design that utilized the available energy to work the wipers, but that certainly would not meet safety standards today. And of course, in those days too, the lack of good filtration and of course the chemistry of the oil has vastly changed over the years. But in those days, the resistance of oil to heat and dirt and so forth, cold, was very rudimentary. And so the recommendation by the oil companies was to change the oil from 750 to 1,000 miles. I remember Gulf had bragged about their 1,000-mile capability between oil changes, but they didn't talk about the dusty roads and so forth when they made that recommendation. Sherman Conway, a high school buddy of mine, had a Model A Ford coupe, and he had two bodies for it. He had a covered body for winter and a convertible body for the summer months. And when the season changed, he unbolted the forebolts from the body and pushed it off and pushed the other one on and pulled it back on. And that I helped him do that once. It wasn't a big job at all. It didn't take any time at all to change the whole body. I'll kind of get diverted here from my 37 to Sherman's Model A. We double dated in that old thing a number of times, and the floorboard on the passenger side was absolutely gone, and the muffler ended just under your feet. So as you were driving along, and of course that old thing always backfired when he lifted the accelerator, and the flames would leap up on the end of that muffler right around your feet. So you had to pay attention to what he was doing in order to avoid getting roasted. But anyway, we were coming home one night, and he lived in Carthus. Carthus is a little town about 7 miles away where Dad worked the last years of his working life. And it's a long hill, at least 2 miles down to the river. But just before you get to the river, the road made a drastic right turn. It was just as sharp as you could, and it was a building right up against the right-of-way on the right side, and on the left side was a long, sloping, steep bank down to Shannon Creek. It was a fairly large creek, and it probably 100 feet down to the creek from the road bank. And there was another hill after that curve that led down to the river, a level crossing. We started down the hill, going as fast as that old Model A would go, probably 50 to 55 miles an hour in its condition. They would go faster than that, but his engine wasn't too primo either, so his sweet spot was in the 50s. But we started down this hill, and we're going along pretty good, and the speed kept going up because of gravity, and he decided to put it in second gear to slow it down a little bit. And when he did, he pushed the clutch in and pushed the gear shift lever forward to put it in second gear, and the clutch pedal broke off. Down below the floorboards, the pedal just fell sideways under his foot. And there we were in neutral, going down this hill and no brake. He pressed on the brakes, but as I said, they wouldn't have stopped us at that curve. So he decided the only thing he could do is try to get it into second gear, which is a pretty low gear in that car, and we'd have been okay with that. And he took the gear shift lever and slammed it forward, and boy, it just, things crashed, and he tore the transmission all to pieces doing that. But fortunately, enough rubble jammed together, and the back wheels just locked up, and boy, that back end started to squeal and bounce up and down, and we swirled around, and we got stopped. Not oh 200 or 300 feet from that curve. 'Cause if we hadn't gotten stopped, we'd have sailed right off the edge of the road down into the creek, and we'd have had some serious issues if we'd have done that. Well, we'd gotten hurt, that's for sure. But anyway, he wasn't far from his house when that happened. So we walked over to his house, and he had an old truck there. We picked it up, picked the back end up and drug it home. It wasn't a couple days later they found another transmission and stuck it in. It wasn't a big deal as far as financial and mechanical repairs were concerned, but that was a pretty scary shot there. Another time we were in Clearfield buzzing around, and we were coming up a street there. I can't remember the name of it anymore, but I know where it's at. It's right in front of a big church. And he decided to make a right turn on the street adjacent to the church. We were coming pretty fast, and as we approached the intersection, a car pulled up, waiting to get onto our street. That took up half the space to get into the street that we were going to go into. I knew we were going too fast. We were going to smash into that car. But he'd already started his turn, and the radius was far too wide to miss the car that was waiting at the stop sign. So when he hit the brake, the right front wheel grabbed, and the back end of that car just whipped sideways, perfectly in line with the opening between the car that was waiting and the clear spot. And we zipped by that parked car there like it was nothing to it. But fortunately, that's one time when the brakes wheel that was going to be braking was the right one. If the left one had braked, we'd have really smashed it. Sherm's old Model A, as all Model A's did, had the gas tank directly in front of the windshield and above the engine, so the fuel flowed by gravity into the engine and eliminated the need for a fuel pump. But one problem was that if you ran low on fuel, the gas would gravitate to the end or to the side of the tank, and fuel wouldn't flow into the engine. And so I know on a couple of occasions we were running awfully thin on fuel, and we were coming up this hill and the old Ford stopped. So we knew what was wrong with it. And so we let it coast backwards and managed to turn around in the middle of the hill. The gas then flowed to the front where the drain hole was, and the old engine started, and we backed up the hill and got back on the level. I traded my old Ford off after about a year for a 41 Mercury. The Mercury didn't have many miles on it, and it was a rare car. It really looked, it hadn't been outside hardly at all, and it was really low mileage, but it had been parked all during the war, and burned oil something often. I put a quart of oil every 200 or 300 miles in it, and I drove it for a while, hoping that it would clear up. But I had to have it rebuilt. I didn't have any place to work on a car. A car parked along the street, you couldn't do an engine job on that. So I took it to a garage, and it cost me $100 to have the engine overhauled, to put new rings in it and cleaned it up, and cleaned the valves and everything. I think it worked fine then. That was a nice car. I liked that car. It was a metallic blue, and one of the early metallics, and it was a nuisance to keep up. They had to be polished about every month in order to keep the aluminum that was exposed to the atmosphere from oxidizing. The flakes were large, fairly large in compared to today's flakes, but They didn't have a clear coat over them to protect them from oxidation. So, but I didn't mind that. I like to keep it clean. They had white walls on it. It was a pretty cool machine. It was in style then. Even though it was a 41, it still was in the realm of looks pretty new, or maybe even new. Yeah, it worked. The girls liked it anyway. So I had a little catastrophe with it too. I had it when we got married and we moved to this little house that we rented, and it had to be parked outside in front of the house there too. So one Sunday morning, we were going to go to church, and I went out to start it up and warm it up, and it had snowed a couple inches or more, and so when I got in the car, I pressed the clutch in and I turned the key and it started up. It always started instantly. Fords are noted for their instant starting, and so it started up, and I got hold of the gear shift lever, and I was pushing it into neutral, and my foot slipped off the clutch. I had snow on the bottom of my shoe, and it slipped off the clutch just as the gear was coming out of its mesh, and it broke some corners off the tooth of the low gear. So they wanted $100 to fix it, which I wasn't going to pay $100 for mechanic work when I could do it myself. But I didn't have any place to do it, so I had to do it there in the driveway. But I didn't have any tools. My tool selection was really limited in those days. I did the job, but that was an unusually large and difficult job on that car, and that's why the price was so high, because the brakes and the whole rear end, the spring and everything had to be disconnected, because the drive shaft was enclosed all the way to the transmission, and the universal joint was up at the transmission. In order to free the transmission and take it out, you had to roll that rear end assembly back out of the way, and that added a lot of work to it, because you had to end up bleeding the brakes and getting involved in a lot of extraneous stuff that shouldn't have been part of the problem or transmission problem. Anyway, I got the transmission out and rebuilt the thing, put new gears in it, put it back together. And I'll be darned if I didn't do the same thing again the following week. Oh boy, I was really... Well, that time I decided to go to Sears and buy some tools. So I bought a set of socket wrenches and some other stuff, some box end wrenches that I still have today, 70 years later. But those tools made the job much easier. And of course, the second time through, I knew exactly what I was doing, and I did it much quicker. Well, once again, I think this has gotten long enough, so we'll stop here and go to the next one.